Welcome to Storyflix Film, where movies are not just watched in a book and bar, they are experienced. Here, we bring you fast, powerful, and engaging movie recaps, turning full films into short, exciting stories without missing the thrill. From action-packed blockbusters to emotional dramas and mind-blowing sci-fi, we break it all down in a way that keeps you hooked till the end. So sit back, relax, and get ready, because every story here is a cinematic journey in minutes. Rambo, First Blood Part I is a 1985 American war action film starring Sylvester Stallone as a Vietnam War veteran John Rambo, a sequel to First Blood, 1982. It is the second installment in the Rambo film series. The film was directed by George P. Cosmatos from a story by Kevin Jarre, with a screenplay by James Cameron and Stallone. It co-stars Richard Crenna, who reprises his role as Colonel Sam Troutman, along with Charles Napier, Julia Nixon, and Stephen Burkhoff. The film's plot is inspired by the Vietnam War POW issue. In the movie, Rambo is released from prison in a deal with the United States government to document the possible existence of missing prisoners of war, POWs, in Vietnam, but is given strict orders not to rescue any. When Rambo defies his orders, he is abandoned and forced once again to rely on his own brutal combat skills to save the POWs. Rambo, First Blood Part I was released on May 22, 1985, by TriStar Pictures, becoming a major global blockbuster, with an estimated box office gross of $150 million in the United States, becoming the second highest grossing film at the domestic box office and the third highest grossing film worldwide in 1985. It has become one of the most recognized installments in the series, having inspired countless rip-offs, parodies, video games, and imitations. In 2009, Entertainment Weekly ranked the movie number 23 on its list of the best Joachim movies of the past 25 years. Despite its success and pop culture status, Rambo, First Blood Part I earned mixed reviews from critics, with many feeling Rambo's compelling nature was lost from its predecessor in favor of a more typical action hero portrayal. Additionally, it was nominated in 7 categories at the 6th Golden Raspberry Awards, winning 4, including a Worst Picture. However, it was nominated for a Best Sound Effects Editing at the 58th Academy Awards. A sequel, Rambo 3, was released in 1988. Plot: 3 years after the incident in Hope, Washington, a former U.S. Army Green Beret John Rambo is imprisoned at a penal labor facility. He is met by Colonel Sam Troutman, his commanding officer during the Vietnam War. Troutman explains that the U.S. government is under pressure because of reports that POWs are still being held in Vietnam. To placate the public, a solo infiltration mission has been approved to confirm these reports, and Rambo's name was suggested as he is versed with the POW cam. Rambo agrees to take the mission in exchange for a presidential pardon. In Thailand, Rambo and Troutman meet helicopter pilot Michael Erickson, his partner Lifer, and Marshal Roger Murdoch, the bureaucrat overseeing the operation. He is instructed to take pictures of a suspected POW camp, but not to engage enemy personnel or attempt a rescue. Troutman is the only person involved in the operation whom Rambo trusts due his suspicions of Murdoch. During his aerial insertion, Rambo's parachute gets caught. He is forced to cut himself free and jettison most of his gear, leaving him only with a knife and a bow and arrow. His assigned contact, Vietnamese intelligence agency Bao, arranges for local river pirates to take them upriver. Rambo reaches the Vietnamese camp, which is commanded by Captain Vine and Lieutenant Tay. Rambo confirms the presence of POWs. Against orders, he frees POW Banks. Rambo, CO and Banks attempt to withdraw, but the river pirates betray them as a Vietnamese gunboat closes in. Rambo kills the pirates and disables the gunboat with an RPG. Before reaching an extraction point, Rambo and Banks separate from company. Under mortar attack, they are spotted by Troutman aboard a rescue helicopter with Erickson and Lifer. Troutman informs base, but Murdoch responds by ordering Erickson to abort the rescue. Leifer holds Troutman at gunpoint, and Rambo and Banks can only watch the helicopter abandon them before they are captured by the Vietnamese. Back at the base, Troutman confronts Murdoch that the mission was a sham, and any evidence of POWs would have been ignored. Murdoch says that the POW discovery would have forced the United States to expend resources, or possibly even start another war to secure the release of a bunch of forgotten ghosts. At the POW camp, Rambo learns that the Vietnamese are being assisted by the Soviet military. Soviet liaison Lieutenant Colonel Sergei Podovsky and his right-hand man, Sergeant Yushin, abuse and interrogate Rambo. Podovsky demands that he broadcast a message to Murdoch as a warning against further rescue missions. Rambo refuses and is tortured with electric shocks. He relents when Banks is brought in and threatened with eye gouging. Rambo dials in a secret radio frequency to contact his base but threatens Murdoch for his treachery, hence saying, "I'm coming to get you." Rambo then overpowers his captors and escapes with the help of Co, who manage to infiltrate the camp. Both are on the run, and Rambo agrees to take CO to the United States. But later, CO is shot by Lieutenant Tay. Rambo promises a dying CO that he will remember her and buries her in the mud, cutting a red headband from her dress and donning her necklace. Rambo begins to kill the Russians and Vietnamese soldiers by guerrilla tactics and weaponry, and kills Tay with an explosive-tipped arrow. Yushin attacks him from a helicopter, but Rambo climbs on board and throws him to his death, hijacks the helicopter, and uses it to bombard the POW camp. He frees Banks and other POWs. They board the captured helicopter, but are pursued by Podovsky in a Mi-24A attack helicopter. Rambo fakes a crash to trick Podovsky, then kills him by destroying his helicopter with a rocket launcher. Rambo and the POWs return to base. Rambo hits Erickson for abandoning him, then destroys all computer equipment in the mission control room. He threatens Murdoch and demands that other POWs be rescued. Troutman tries to convince Rambo to return to a peaceful life at home, but Rambo refuses, saying that he wants the country to care for its soldiers, just like how they care for the country. Troutman then asks Rambo how he would live, to which Rambo replies day by day as he walks off into the distance. Cached main article: A list of Rambo characters. A since Sylvester Stallone also John J. Rambo. A since Richard Crenna also Colonel Samuel R. Sam Troutman. I since Charles Napier as Major Marshal Roger T. Murdoch. A since Stephen Burkhoff as Lieutenant Colonel Sergei T. Podovsky. A since Julia Nixon as Agent C.O. Phuong Bao. A since Martin Kavia as Michael Reed Erickson. I since George Chung as Lieutenant Tay. A since Andy Wood as Banks. A since Steve Williams as Leifer. A since William Gent as Captain Vine. A since Voyogerka as Sergeant Yushin. A since Dana Lee as Captain Strongkind. Production development and writing development of a sequel to A First Blood began with Coralco Pictures sold for Igna distribution rights to distributors in Europe and Japan in 1983. Initially scheduling the film for a December 1984 release, it was later rescheduled for August 1, 1985. Then up-and-coming screenwriter Kevin Jarre had written a story tremenda that was liked by both the producers and Sylvester Stallone. Jarre later recalled in an interview in the documentary A Tinsel at the Lost Movie about Hollywood, "I wrote the first draft of Rambo, and I just did it. I was living on dog food at the time and I needed a gig and I wanted to finish a spec script I was writing. And they called. Stallone called me in and they had this idea about what they should do in the sequel to A First Blood and I said, well, how about if maybe he searches for POWs in Southeast Asia and back in Vietnam?" He said, "Great, let's do it." Despite this, the film has many similarities both in script and in directing style with the Ted Koch and Common Valor, which was also produced by Abbas Fchns. James Cameron was then hired to write a first draft of the screenplay, which he was concurrently writing along with The Terminator and Aliens, both of which he would go on to direct. Cameron had been recommended by David Giler, who did some end credits as script work on the first film. Cameron's first draft was titled A First Blood 2, The Mission. 9. According to Cameron, His script had the same basic structure of the first film, but was more violent than its predecessor. Cameron was quoted in an October 1986 issue of Monsterland magazine. "It was quite a different film from my first Blood, apart from the continuation of the Rambo character. The first one was set in a small town, it had a different social consciousness from the second one, which was a very broad, stylized adventure. It was a little more violent in its execution than I had in mind in the writing." Following Cameron's initial draft, Stallone took over scriptwriting duties, creating a final draft. Jar received solely a story credit, while Stallone and Cameron were credited for the screenplay. Jar would defensively say that almost nothing of his original treatment ended up in the final script, while Cameron would comment that he only wrote the action and that Stallone wrote the politics. In a December 2006 Q&A with the Ain't It Cool News, Stallone recalled, "I think that James Cameron is a brilliant talent, but I thought the politics were important, such as a right-wing stance coming from Mana and his nemesis, Murdoch, contrasted by Rambo's obvious neutrality, which I believe is explained in Rambo's final speech. I realize his speech at the end may have caused millions of viewers to burst veins in their eyeballs, spiraling them excessively, but the sentiment stated was conveyed to me by many veterans." Also, in his original draft it took nearly 40 pages to have any action initiated, and Rambo was partnered with a tech-y sidekick, so it was more than just politics that were put into the script. There was also a simpler storyline. If James Cameron says anything more than that, then he realizes he's now doing the backstroke badly in a pool of lies. Producers wanted Rambo to have a partner for the POW rescue mission. They wanted John Travolta to play Rambo's sidekick, but Stallone vetoed the idea. Lee Marvina, who had been considered for the role of Colonel Troutman in the first film, was offered the role of Marshal Roger Murdoch, but declined, and the role was given to Charles Napier. Before filming started, Stallone went through torturous trainings to build the perfect musculature. Writer David J. Moore said in the 2019 documentary film In Search of the Last Action Heroes, "Here's a guy who went against the grain in everything that he ever did. Here's a guy who transformed himself, literally he chiseled his own body into this statuesque, muscular specimen." AS42:00AS Filming the film was shot between June and August 1984 on location in the state of Guerrero, Mexico, and Thailand. While vacationing in Acapulco, Ron South was hired on as assistant editor and his film career began. During filming, a special effects man Clifford P. Winger Jr. was accidentally killed during one of the film's waterfall explosions, when he lost his footing and fell to his death. Music main article A Rambo, First Blood Part 2 The musical scoria was composed by Jerry Goldsmith, conducting the British National Philharmonic Orchestra. Although Goldsmith also made heavy use of electronic synthesized elements. The main song piece Inner Life is sung by Stallone's brother, singer-songwriter Frank Stallone. Record label Vare-Diaresis say Sarabandia issued the original soundtrack album. Release marketing unusually for the time. A teaser trailer for Rambo, First Blood Part I then titled A First Blood Part 2. The Mishnah was released in 3,000 theaters in the summer of 1984, over a year before the scheduled release date of August 1, 1985, and several months before any footage for the film was completed. Producer Mario Cassara arranged this to capitalize on the popularity of the first film. The film was also marketed through merchandising, with posters of Rambo selling rapidly. Although the film was rated raw and directed at adults, tie-in toys were created for at-home media. The video was released in the United States by Authority, HBO Video in early 1986 and sold a record 425,000 units on opening day, a record at the time for a tape with a retail price of $79.95, surpassing the 410,000 sold by Ghostbusters. Rambo, First Blood Part I was released on DVD on November 23, 2004. A Blu-ray release followed on May 23, 2008. A Rambo, First Blood Part II was released on 4K UHD Blu-ray on November 13, 2018. Reception box office. Rambo, First Blood Part II opened in the United States on May 22, 1985, in a then record 2,074 theaters, becoming the first film to be released to over 2,000 theaters in the United States, and was the #1 film that weekend, grossing $20.2 million. Overall, the film grossed $150.4 million in the US and Canada, and $150 million internationally, for a worldwide total of $300.4 million. The film broke various international box office records. It set an opening weekend record in the United Kingdom with a gross of £1.1 million from 322 screens, surpassing the record set by E.T. the Extraterrestrial, 1982. In France, the film had a record opening day with 269,564 admissions and a record week with 2,075,238 admissions. Critical response. And now Rotten Tomatoes, the film has an approval rating of 33% based on 46 reviews. The site's consensus is Rambo, First Blood Part II offers enough mayhem to satisfy genre fans, but remains a regressive sequel that turns its once compelling protagonist into just another muscled action berserker. On Metacritic, the film has a weighted average score of 47 out of 100 based on reviews from 15 critics, indicating mixed or average reviews. Vincent Canbiofa, the New York Times, called the film almost as opportunistic as the Congressman it pretends to abhor. In spite of everything it says, it's much less interested in the MIA question than it is in finding a topical frame for the kind of action-adventure film in which Mr. Stallone's torso and his vacant stare can do what his fans like best, that is, fight, outwit and kill, usually all by himself, dozens of far better armed but lesser mortals. Ava Richa wrote, "The charade on the screen, which is not pulled off, is to accept that the underdog Rambo character, albeit with the machine gun wielding help of an attractive Vietnamese girl, can waste hordes of Viet Cong and a Red Army contingents en route to hauling POWs to a Thai airbase in a smoking Russian chopper with only a facial scar, from a branding iron knife point, marring his tough figure. You never even see him eating in this fantasy, as if his body feeds on itself." Gene Siskel of the Chicago Tribune gave the film 3 stars out of 4 and called it very good at what it does, but what it does isn't always that good, referring to the depiction of the enemy as going back to the image of Thea Yellow Peril, to the notion that white is right and other colors are wrong. Hal Wilmington of the Los Angeles Times wrote, "If a character can seemingly do anything, it's hard to feel tension or concern about his fate. At least to Superman had a kryptonite, we are left with nothing but detached aesthetic appreciation, watching Rambo race through several $1 million worth of explosions and aerial attacks, coruscant fireballs billowing everywhere and bodies flying hither and yon." Except for anyone irretrievably into violent power fantasies, this will probably soon pall. Pauline Kaelo commented in The New Yorker, "The director, George P. Cosmatos, gives this near-psychotic material a mixture of Catholica iconography and a soldier of fortuna pulp veneer of professionalism, but the looniness is always there." 31. Paul Attanasio of The Washington Post wrote, "At best, a Rambo, First Blood Part II is a crudely effective right-wing rabble-rouser, the artistic equivalent of carpet bombing a you don't know whether to cheer or run for cover. At worst, it's a tribute to Sylvester Stallone, by Sylvester Stallone, starring Sylvester Stallone." John Nubbin reviewed Rambo, First Blood Part II for A Different Worlds magazine and stated that beyond its usefulness as a national purging, A Rambo is also a terrific action picture. A Cardiff's photography is better than ever. He has unleashed his style with a vengeance, using the screen as a canvas which he has decorated as cleverly as it is possible. His storytelling techniques here are some of the finest we've seen from anyone in quite some time. Goldsmith's score is strong and original, the best work he has delivered in quite a while as well. The film is listed in a Golden Raspberry Award founder John Wilson's book at the official Razzie Movie Guide as one of the 100 most enjoyably bad movies ever made. He is negotiating Thea return on investment for his own soul, demanding to know if the emotional capital he is about to expend will yield a tangible victory. He is demanding to know if the blood he spills will be a currency that buys something real or if it will be another sunk cost like Thea war itself, a bad debt written off by a man in suits. The transition to Atlanta introduces us to the film's true antagonist, Marshall Murdoch, a bureaucrat who manages the war from an air-conditioned office filled with the computers and monitors. The quintessential middle manager of the apocalypse, Murdoch represents the administrative state, the force that quantifies human life into data points and acceptably loss ratios, viewing the war not as a moral struggle, but as a spreadsheet to be balanced. His briefing is a masterclass in corporate obfuscation. He emphasizes that Rambo's mission is a reconnaissance only. He is to take photos, not action, a mandate that neuters the asset before it is even deployed. This instruction is the hedge Murdoch is betting against finding anything because finding live PS would require a massive political expenditure that the administration is unwilling to pay, a liability they cannot afford to carry. The armoring up sequence that follows is a fetishization of the tools of labor, a visual inventory of the specialized equipment that defines the protagonist's market niche. We see the specific assets Rambo brings to the market: the serrated survival knife designed by Jimmy Lyle, the Hoyt compound bow with its explosive torque, the black combat gear that absorbs the light. These montage serves to re-establish Rambo's value proposition. He is not just a man, he is a platform of destruction, and every buckle tightened is a promise of the violence to come, a contract signed in steel and leather. The deployment sequence introduces the first friction in the operation. A suit anti-malfunction during the halo jump leaves Rambo hanging from the strut of the aircraft, strangled by the very technology meant to deliver him. As he hangs in the slipstream, he makes the critical decision to cut away the high-tech gear to save the biological asset himself. Severing his tether to the modern military apparatus, he falls into the jungle with only his knife and his bow, a narrative reset that strips away the technological advantage of the American military and forces the protagonist to rely on sweat equity. He lands in the dark canopy, birthing himself into the hostile environment, not as a soldier of the estate, but as a creature of the jungle, an analog warrior in a digital war. On the ground, he establishes contact with a Koba, a local intelligence asset which serves as the necessary bridge between the foreign invader and the indigenous landscape, the interface for his operations. Their initial dialogue is functional, yet it establishes the expendable theme that defines Rambo's psychology and his understanding of his place in the hierarchy. When Q asks why he was chosen, Rambo's response, "I'm expendable," is a chilling self-appraisal of his own market value, an admission that he knows he is a depreciating asset. He understands that to the man in Washington, he is useful only for the specific transaction and easily written off if the deal goes bad. A piece of inventory to be liquidated. The journey upriver is a slow burn of atmospheric tension, utilizing the claustrophobic geography of the jungle to build the pressure cooker of the narrative, a descent into the heart of the business. The film takes its time here, allowing the audience to feel the humidity, the waiting, the sheer logistical weight of moving through hostile territory without a support. The encounter with the Rivera pirates serves as a preliminary audit of Rambo's lethal capabilities. A small-scale skirmish that validates his combat readiness before the main event. It is a proof of concept for the violence that will follow, demonstrating that his reflexes are still liquid assets despite his time in prison, and that his value is intact. When they finally infiltrate the camp, the mission parameters shift from abstract data collection to concrete reality, and the theoretical model of the mission collapses. Rambo observes the camp through his camera lens, ostensibly fulfilling his contract to simply document the emptiness of the location for the files. However, the lens reveals the black swan event that Murdoch gambled against: living American prisoners of war, emaciated and rotting in bamboo cages. The sight of the ghosts of a war the country tried to forget shatters the bureaucratic mandate and forces a hostile takeover of the mission's objectives. Rambo is faced with a choice between a contract, take photos, and the moral imperative, save the men, a conflict between his legal obligation and his ethical debt. In a decision that defines the film's ethos, he defaults on Thea's contract to honor the higher debt to his brothers, proving that his currency is loyalty, not orders. He ceases to be an observer and becomes an active participant, infiltrating the camp infrastructure with the silence of a predator, moving like a shadow across the balance sheet. The extraction of the prisoner banks is a sequence of extreme tension, utilizing silence as a weapon and leveraging the element of surprise to acquire the asset. Rambo moves through the mud and under the floorboards, a visual representation of the guerrilla tactics that defeated the American army a decade prior, now used against the captors. He is appropriating the enemy's methods to achieve what the massive American war machine could not, a successful rescue of a single valuable life. As he drags the banks toward the extraction point, the film accelerates into a frantic chase, at the silence broken by the roar of the alarm, the market reacting to his move. They reach the clearing, the designated marketplace for the transaction, where the helicopter is scheduled to pick up the goods and close the deal. The helicopter descends, the wind whipping at the grass, the salvation of the prisoner seemingly guaranteed, the investment about to pay off. But then the betrayal happens, the rug pull that serves as the film's inciting incident for the second act and the ultimate breach of contract. Murdoch, monitoring the situation via radio, learns that Rambo has a live PA with him, a liability that changes the entire math of the clears throat operation. He performs a split-second cost-benefit analysis. Bringing back a live prisoner would expose the lie of the clean war and cost the administration billions. Clears throat, in reparations and a political capital. He issues the order, abort, a single word that liquidates the asset in the field to protect the sovereignty of the firm back home. The helicopter pulls up, abandoning the asset in the field, leaving Rambo and the sickly prisoner stranded in the open. We see the look of devastation on Colonel Troutman's face, the middle manager, who realizes his company is corrupt, and the look of stoic acceptance on Rambo's face. He watches the machine leave, realizing that the system has not just failed him, it has actively sold him to the enemy to protect its own profit margins. He is captured, surrounded by the enemy, stripped of his weapons, and beaten. Tessa clears throat, value apparently reduced to zero. This moment is the emotional nadir of the film, the point of maximum insolvency for the protagonist, where all his investments have failed. He has no weapons, no backup, no government support, and he is in the hands of the Soviet and Vietnamese forces, a prisoner once again. But this total liquidation of his assets is necessary for the narrative. It clears the ledger and sets the stage for a new economy of violence. The contract with America is now void, and Rambo no longer works for the government. He is now a freelance arena, the business of revenge. The betrayal by Murdoch provides the moral license for the absolute carnage that is about to follow, justifying every explosion and every kill. The audience, having witnessed the supreme act of corporate cowardice, is now fully invested in the hostile takeover that Rambo is about to execute. The setup is complete. The data has been issued. The default has occurred and the collection agent is about to wake up and demand payment in full. The narrative pivot into the second half begins with the protagonist in a state of absolute insolvency, strapped to a box spring in a rat-infested bamboo hut, his physical capital completely leveraged by the enemy. Enter Lieutenant Colin Lopodovsky, the Soviet antagonist who functions as the competing CEO in the geopolitical marketplace, a man who believes that pain is the only currency that creates loyalty. Podovsky treats a Rambo not as a soldier, but as a distressed asset to be broken down and repurposed for propaganda, attempting to force a confession that will validate the Soviet investment in the region. The interrogation scene is a clash of operating systems. Bedavsky uses the external pressure of electricity, a technological force, while Rambo relies on the internal fusion of trauma and resilience. The torture is a stress test of the hero's value, a calculated attempt to find the breaking point of the American psyche, but it fails because Rambo's value is backed by a reserve of will that the Soviet calculator cannot quantify. The turning point occurs when they force Rambo to the radio to contact Murdoch, expecting a concession speech that will serve as a dividend for their efforts. Instead, Rambo engages in a hostile takeover of the communication channel, delivering the iconic line, "Murdoch, I'm coming to get you," which functions as a unilateral declaration of a new contract. This is the moment that the Vengeancia algorithm is activated. The objective here shifts from survival to total liquidation of the opposing firm's assets. The escape that follows is a masterclass in kinetic efficiency, utilizing the environment as a force multiplier against superior numbers. Rambo utilizes a microphone as a weapon, a symbolic act of turning the tools of communication into instruments of blunt force trauma. He exits the hut and enters the rice paddies, the cinematography shifting to a frantic handheld style that mirrors the chaos of the market correction he is about to unleash. The pursuit into the jungle marks the transition from defensive maneuvering to offensive restructuring. Rambo systematically dismantles the Soviet and Vietnamese pursuit teams, utilizing guerrilla economics, low cost, high impact traps that yield a maximum return on violence. The mud, while a sequence is the visual centerpiece of this act where Rambo camouflages himself within the very geology of the battlefield, becoming indistinguishably from the earth itself. When he opens his eyes within the mudbank, it is the film's most potent metaphor. The land itself has grown eyes and is now hunting at the invaders. He ambushes the soldier. A sudden explosion of biological violence that reclaims the initiative and liquidates the enemy's advantage. The narrative then accelerates into a montage of asset seizure as Rambo acquires Soviet weaponry, upgrading his portfolio from primitive bow and arrow to the industrial lethality of the AK-47 and the RPG. He moves through the village, a one-man demolition crew, destroying the logistical infrastructure of the enemy camp, guard towers, barracks, and vehicles are written off the books in a rapid succession. This is the payoff efficiency the audience has been waiting for. Every explosion is a dividend paid on the emotional investment of the first hour. The sequence at the waterfall where he is pinned down by the helicopter forces him to expend his last remaining arrow. At the explosive dip, the destruction of the enemy lieutenant is a high-risk high-reward trade, clearing the path for the acquisition of the ultimate capital asset, the Soviet Hind gunship. Rambo hijacks the helicopter, effectively stealing the enemy's flagship technology and turning it against them. A corporate raid executed at 2,000 feet. He returns to the prison camp, not to flee, but to close the account on the PS. The aerial assault on the camp is a sequence of absolute dominance where the Angel of Death descends to liberate the lost assets using the enemy's own heavy artillery to sanitize the landing zone. He loads the PS onto the gunship, securing the goods that Murdoch claimed did not exist, thereby validating the entire purpose of the mission. The dogfight that ensues with Petovsky's gunship is a clash of titans, a final merger negotiation conducted with the air-to-air missiles. Rambo outmaneuvers the superior Soviet craft by playing a game of chicken, faking a crash to lure the enemy into a vulnerable position. A classic bluff and game theory. The destruction of Petovsky's helicopter is the final liquidation of the Soviet presence in the film's narrative economy. The competition has been eliminated. Rambo then flies the damaged gunship back to the American base in Thailand. The engine smoking, the physical stress on the airframe, mirroring the stress on the pilot. He lands the massive machine directly in front of Murdoch's command center. A physical intrusion of the war into the sterile air-conditioned office space. The confrontation that follows is the boardroom showdown where the laborer finally confronts the manager who sold him out. Rambo creates his own door with the M60 machine gun, destroying the expensive technology, the computers, the radios, the teletype machines that Murdoch used to lie to the world. He corners Murdoch against the desk, the symbol of bureaucratic power, and holds the serrated knife to his throat. The audience expects a kill, a final transaction of blood. But Rambo chooses a different currency, fear. He issues a command to find the other PS, leveraging his physical dominance to force a policy change in the administration. It is a moment of supreme restraint, proving that he is not a mindless killing machine, but a moral agent operating with a distinct code of ethics. As he walks out to the helicopter to debrief with Troutman, The film delivers its thematic thesis statement. Troutmana asks him what he wants, offering Menelsa and citations, the fiat currency of the military. Rambo rejects these symbols, delivering the soliloquy that defines the blue-collar patriotism of the franchise. I want what they want, and every other guy who came over here and spilled his guts and gave everything he had wants for our country to love us as much as we love it. This line is the emotional roar of the entire film. It reframes the violence not as hatred for the enemy, but as a desperate plea for validation from the homeland. It positions the veteran not as a victim, but as a spurned lover of his own nation, demanding only reciprocity in the relationship. Troutman watches him walk away, a silhouette against the setting sun, a wandering Ronin who has settled at the account but can never truly go home. The credits roll over the image of a Mana who has won the war but lost the peace. A final lingering note of melancholia that adds value to the action that preceded it. The books are closed, the audit is complete, and the audience leaves the theater having received their full measure of vengeance and validation. To truly decode the operating system of Rambo First Blood Part 2, we must move beyond the surface level kinetics of the action genre and conduct a forensic audit of the character psychology through the lens of behavioral economics. The central conflict of the film is not merely a physical war between nations, but a clash between two incompatible currency systems. The gold standard of a visceral physical experience versus the fiat currency of political bureaucracy. John Rambo functions as the ultimate distressed asset in this economy. He is a man whose primary value, lethal proficiency, was artificially inflated during the Vietnam War, only to be written down to zero once the market for violence crashed in 1975. His psychology is defined by the sunk cost fallacy of the veteran. He has invested so much of his spiritual and physical capital into the concept of patriotism that he cannot devastate when the nation itself has defaulted another debt. In the opening scenes, Rambo is not looking for a profit in the traditional sense. He displays zero interest in the financial compensation of the mission, viewing money as a soft currency that has no utility in the jungle. Instead, he is seeking an emotional ROI, a validation of his suffering, a confirmation that the expenditure of his youth and his friends' lives purchased something of tangible value. This makes him a value investor in the truest sense. He is willing to endure short-term volatility, imprisonment, torture, betrayal because he believes the long-term fundamentals of loyalty and brotherhood are still sound despite the market society betting against them. Marshall Murdoch conversely represents the administrative state and operates strictly on a philosophy of risk mitigation. As a character study, Murdoch is the personification of the corporate manager who views human resources as liability entries on a balance sheet. His psychological profile is dominated by a loss aversion. He is not trying to win the war, which would require infinite capital, but rather to manage the perception of the loss so that it does not bankrupt the administration's political capital. He utilizes asymmetric information as his primary weapon, hiding the truth about the set to manipulate the market price of the emission. To Murdoch, the existence of live prisoners is a black swan event, an unpredictable catastrophe that threatens to ruin his meticulously crafted model of a clean post-war peace. His decision to abort the mission is not an act of malice in his worldview. It is a stop-loss order executed to prevent a further exposure to a bad investment. The friction between Rambo and Murdoch is the friction between labor and management. Rambo produces the value, the rescue, while Murdoch attempts to control the distribution of that value to ensure it serves the shareholders, the politicians. Colonel Troutman occupies the precarious role of the middle manager, caught between the labor force he respects and the corporate board he serves. Troutman's psychology is defined by a cognitive dissonance. He knows the system is corrupt, yet he continues to operate within it, hoping to leverage his influence to protect his specific asset, Rambo. He functions as a market maker, facilitating the transaction between the wild volatility of Rambo and the sterile order of Murdoch, trying to maintain liquidity in a market that is freezing up. His loyalty to Rambo is the only hard asset he possesses, yet his uniform binds him to the soft money of the establishment. creating a perpetual internal conflict that renders Thema largely impotent until the final act. Koba, the female intelligence asset, introduces a third economic model, the merger of necessity. Her motivation is grounded in aspirational capital. She invests here safety and local knowledge in Rambo's mission, not for ideology, but for the promise of a visa, an exit strategy from a failing market, post-war Vietnam, to a booming one, America. Her relationship with Rambo is transactional, but evolves into a joint venture based on shared risk. She provides the local infrastructure, the boat, the disguise, and he provides the security. The tragedy of her character is that she attempts to diversify Rambo's portfolio, offering him a future that includes something other than war. PC dividend. Her death is the market correction that forces Rambo back into his core competency of violence. Ida eliminates the possibility of a peaceful merger and reconfirms that his only viable asset is his ability to destroy. The Soviet antagonist, Lieutenant Colonel Podovsky, operates on a model of a coercive monopoly. He views the battlefield not as a market, but as a territory to be dominated through absolute control of the supply chain of pain. This interrogation of Rambo is an attempt to force a hostile takeover of the American narrative. He wants Rambo to broadcast a message that validates the Soviet presence, essentially demanding a public testimonial for a defective product. Podovsky's failure lies in his misunderstanding of Rambo's break-even point. He assumes that every man has a price, a threshold of pain worth will sell out. He fails to realize that Rambo has already declared bankruptcy in his own life. A man who considers himself expendable, has no assets left to seize, and therefore cannot be leveraged. The torture scene is a stress test that Rambo passes because his psychological equity is infinite. He draws from a reserve of trauma that Podovsky cannot audit. When Rambo finally turns the tables, it is an act of repossessing the narrative. He seizes the means of production, the radio, the weapons, and dictates the new terms of the deal. The final confrontation with Murdoch is not a murder, but a restructuring. Rambo does not liquidate Murdoch, kill him, which would be a short-term satisfying trade, but a long-term strategic error. Instead, he forces a management shake-up using the threat of violence to compel the release of the remaining assets. The PS. This demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of leverage. A dead bureaucrat is a martyr, but a terrified bureaucrat is a tool that can be used to extract further value. By sparing a Murdoch, Rambo ensures that the debt remains on the books, forcing the system to confront its obligations rather than writing them off. Ultimately, the film argues that the psychological economy of the soldier is fundamentally incompatible with the political economy of the state. The soldier deals in absolutes, life, death, loyalty, while the state deals in derivatives, a perception, polling, budget. Rambo's final walk into the sunset is the exit of a sole proprietor who realizes that the corporate world has nothing to offer him. He rejects the bonus structure, medals, accolades because he knows the currency is debased. He chooses instead to remain in the gray market of the exile, the only place where his specific set of skills retains its purchasing power. This psychological autonomy is what resonates with the audience. In a world of complex interrelated economic dependencies, a Rambo represents the fantasy of the sovereign individual, a man who owes nothing, owns nothing, and cannot be bought. He is the ultimate hedge against the collapse of civilization, a reminder that when the complex financial instruments of society fail, the only currency that matters is the iron will of the individual survivor. To understand the seismic impact of Rambo First Blood Part 2, we must perform a forensic audit of its financial architecture, stripping away the mythology to reveal the cold, hard cash flow that made it possible. The production was not merely a sequel. Ida was a leveraged buyout of the action genre, a calculated risk by the independent studio Cargo Pictures to corner the market on high-octane spectacle. The initial capitalization for the project was set at a staggering $25 million, a budget that was nearly doubly that of the original First Blood. 1982, representing a massive escalation in the cost of goods sold. This capital injection was allocated primarily to three sectors: talent acquisition, A. Sylvester Stallone's salary, physical assets, practical effects, and locational logistics, and marketing expenditure, at the P&A budget. Stallone, fresh off the success of the Rocky franchise, negotiated a deal that included a significant back-end percentage of the gross, a structure that aligned his incentives perfectly with the studio's need for a global blockbuster. This profit participation model meant that every ticket sold was a direct dividend to the star, creating a powerful economic engine that drove the film's promotional machinery. The risk profile for the project was high. The mid-80s marketplace was crowded with the competitors like Commando and Missing in Action, and the Vietnam War movie was generally considered a genre of tragic introspection. See The Deer Hunter or Apocalypse Now, not commercial triumph. However, the producers identified a market inefficiency, a massively underserved demographic of blue-collar Americans who felt alienated by the cynical tone of New Hollywood and were desperate for a narrative that validated their patriotism. They bet the farm on vengeancia arbitrage, the idea that audiences would pay a premium to see a fictional Victoria that corrected the historical defeat. The production budget was also heavily impacted by location costs. Filming in Mexico to simulate Vietnam required the construction of massive practical sets, including the prison camp and the waterfall sequence, which functioned as capital expenditures that could not be repurposed. The destruction of these sets during a filming, literally blowing up the investment, was a necessary write-off to achieve the level of visual fidelity required to sell the illusion. Every explosion on screen represented thousands of dollars in pyrotechnical materials and labor, a literal burning of cash to generate production value. The marketing campaign was a masterclass in brand positioning. The poster art featuring the iconic image of Rambo with the RPG became a ubiquitous symbol of American strength, effectively testing the national mood. The trailer strategy focused exclusively on the high-yield moments of the film, the helicopter dogfight, the explosive arrows, the machine gun fire, creating a promise of spectacle that justified the ticket price. This trailer-centric marketing created a massive opening weekend surge, generating significant upfront liquidity for the studio and allowing them to recoup a substantial portion of the production budget in the first 3 days. The film opened to a domestic gross of over $20 million, a record-breaking figure for an R-rated movie at the time, instantly validating the blockbuster strategy. The domestic box office eventually totaled over $150 million, a figure that was multiplied by the international revenue stream, which proved to be even more lucrative. Globally, the film grossed over $308 million, a return on investment of over 1,000%, making it one of the most profitable films of the decade. But the financial story does not end at the box office. The long-tail revenue generated by the film was astronomical. The home video market, VHS, was exploding in 1985. And Rambo became the definitive rental asset for video stores across America. Every VHS tape sold or rented was a recurring revenue stream with zero marginal cost for the studio, turning the film into a cash cow that continued to generate profits for years after its theatrical run. Merchandising was another key component of the film's financial success. Despite its R rating, the character of Rambo was licensed for toys, lunchboxes, and even a cartoon series, creating a cross-generational brand that introduced the character to children who were not old enough to see the movie. This controversial strategy of damaging the IP allowed Carroll to monetize the brand across multiple demographics, maximizing the lifetime value of the customer. The syndication rights for television broadcast were also sold for a premium as the film's high-action content made it a perfect fit for cable networks looking to attract a male demographic. The cultural capital generated by the film was immense. The image of Rambo became shorthand for aggressive foreign policy, and the term Rambo entered the global lexicon as a synonym for a one-man army. This cultural impact translated into brand equity for Stallone, cementing his status as the highest paid actor in the world and giving him the leverage to greenlight future projects. However, the film also faced significant reputational risk. Critics derided it as jingoistic propaganda, and it swept the Golden Raspberry Awards for Worst Picture, Worst Actor, and worst screenplay. Yet, in a fascinating display of the critic audience gap, these negative reviews had zero impact on the film's financial performance. If anything, the controversy served as free media, fueling the conversation and driving more people to the theater. The success of Rambo First Blood Part 2 also had a profound impact on the studio ecosystem, validating the rise of the independent production company as a major player in Hollywood. Carroll Company used the profits from Rambo to fund a slate of ambitious action films, including Total Recall and Terminator 2, Judgment Day, effectively reshaping the blockbuster landscape of the late 80s and early 90s. The film proved that the high-concept action movie was a viable business model capable of generating returns that rivaled the biggest studio tentpoles. It demonstrated that star power was a bankable asset and that audiences were willing to forgive plot holes and illogical inconsistencies in exchange for visceral thrills and emotional catharsis. The break-even point for the film was likely reached within the first week of release, meaning that every dollar earned thereafter was pure profit, a financial home run that is rare in the higher world of film production. Ultimately, the financial autopsy of Rambo First Blood Part 2 reveals a perfect storm of timing, talent, and a market demand. It was a product that the world didn't know it needed until it arrived. A cinematic commodity that tapped into a deep vein of cultural anxiety and turned it into gold. The ROI was not just measured in dollars, but in the enduring legacy of the character, a brand that continues to generate revenue for decades later. It is a testament to the power of cinema as a business, proving that when art and commerce align perfectly, the result is nothing short of explosive. The ledger is closed, the profits are booked, and the shareholders are very, very happy. To decode the visual language of Rambo First Blood, Part 2, we must first understand the technological constraints and innovations of 1985, an era defined by the absolute peak of analog engineering before the digital revolution sanitized the action genre. The tech stack employed by the production was not merely a collection of cameras and lenses. It was a heavy industrial workflow designed to capture the visceral texture of kinetic energy in a way that modern sensors simply cannot replicate. The primary acquisition format was 35mm anamorphic film utilizing the Panavision system, a choice that fundamentally dictated the aspect ratio of the film and its subconscious impact on the viewer. The anamorphic lens does not just capture an image, it compresses space, squeezing a wide field of view onto a square frame of film which is then optically decompressed during projection. This optical engineering creates the signature cinemascope look. The horizontal lens flares, the oval bokeh in the out-of-focus areas, and the slight geometric distortion at the edges of the frame. Director George Pete, Cosmas, and cinematographer Jack Cardiff utilized these optical characteristics to turn the jungle into a panoramic stage, a widescreen canvas where the chaotic density of the foliage could be rendered with microscopic clarity. The choice of lenses was critical. They employed high-speed prime lenses that allowed them to shoot in the low light conditions of the deep canopy and the magic hour without sacrificing the resolution of the image. This was a high-risk technical decision. Also, anamorphic lenses have a notoriously shallow depth of field, meaning that the focus puller had to operate with a surgical precision to keep a moving target like Rambo sharp against a blurred background. But the true technological marvel of this film lies in its physical effects pipeline, a methodology that relied on chemical reactions and mechanical engineering rather than pixel manipulation. In 1985, if you wanted an explosion, you had to actually blow something up. There was no Command C to undo a mistake and no digital fire to composite over a safety shot. The pyrotechnic team, led by industry veterans, treated the explosions not as chaotic events, but also sculpted sculptures of flame engineered using specific mixtures of gasoline, diesel, and black powder to achieve the desired color, temperature, and an expansion rate. The hip drops were simulated using massive fuel mortars buried in the ground, timed to detonate in a precise sequence that mimicked the rolling wall of fire associated with the aerial bombardment. This is hazardous material engineering. The heat generated by these blasts was surreal. The shock waves were real, and the danger to the stunt performers was a tangible variable that had to be managed on the set. We see this reality in the reaction shots. The way the actors flinch is not acting. It is a physiological response to the thermal irradiation of a chemical event occurring 50 feet away. The film also pioneered the use of hard-mount camera systems on the helicopters, bolting the heavy airfogs cameras directly to the airframes of the Bell 212 and the aerospatial Puma. These allowed for the capture of aerial combat with a stability and immediacy that a handheld camera work could not achieve, turning the helicopter itself into a massive flying camera dolly. Speaking of the helicopters, the Soviet Hind gun Sheepa is a masterpiece of practical engineering since actual Soviet hardware was unavailable during the Cold War. The production modified a French Puma helicopter with fabricated wings, weapon pods, and a redesigned nose cone to mimic the silhouette of the Mi-24. This physical mock-up approach meant that the aircraft had to be aerodynamically re-certified, a complex process of aeronautical engineering to ensure that the cosmetic additions did not compromise the flight envelope of the machine. The weaponry featured in the film was also treated with a level of technical fetishism that bordered on pornography. The Hoy archery compound bow used by Rambo was a custom-engineered piece of technology featuring a specific pulley system designed to generate over 100 lb draw weight. The explosive tips were practical props rigged with similar charges. But for the impact shots, the special effects team used compressed air cannons to fire the arrows with enough velocity to shatter targets, creating a kinetic impact that felt heavy and lethal. The M60 machine gun was modified to cycle blank ammunition at a rate that maximized the muzzle flash, a visual flare that was enhanced by the specific shutter angle of the camera to ensure it registered on the film stock. The sound attack, though discussed later, relied heavily on the Niagara analog tape recorders, capturing the noise floor of the jungle, the insects, the wind, the water to create a bed of organic sound that grounded the technological violence. The editing process executed on mobile flatbeds was a physical act of cutting and splicing celluloid, a tactile workflow that imposed a specific rhythm on the action sequences. Editors rarely had the luxury of non-linear experimentation. They had to commit to the cut, creating a linear velocity in the pacing that feels relentless and driving. The color science of the film was dictated by the photochemical process of the laboratory. The film stock was pushed to enhance the contrast, crushing the blacks to create a deep, impenetrable shadows while letting the highlights of the fire and the sweat blow out into pure white. This high contrast look was intentional visual engineering designed to make the image pop on the drive-in screens and second-run theaters where the film would make its long-tail revenue. Even the sweat in Sylvester Stallone's body was a make-up effect innovation. A specific mixture of oil and water sprayed constantly to create a reflective surface that caught the rim lighting, turning his musculature into a topographic map of effort. This is bioengineering of the star image. The body itself is treated as a piece of technology, a machine that glistens with a hydraulic fluid sweat as it operates at a maximum capacity. The film also utilized front projection techniques for certain cockpit shots, a pre-digital method of compositing that required precise alignment of the camera and the projector to hide the shadows, a technique that dates back to 2001, A Space Odyssey, but was refined here for action. However, the majority of the aerial work was practical, requiring the stunt pilots to fly dangerously close to the tree line and to each other, a logistical risk that no insurance company would underwrite today. The tragic death of stuntman Cliff Wingandra Jr. during a motor effect gone wrong serves as a grim reminder of the human cost of this analog technology. The danger on screen was a direct transfer of the danger on set. Ultimately, the tech stack of Rambo First Blood Part 2 is a testament to the heavy industry era of film where spectacle was built with steel, fuel, and optics rather than a code. It is a film that feels heavy because it is heavy. The cameras were heavy, the helicopters were heavy, and the explosions were heavy. This weight translates to the viewer as cinematic authority, a subconscious assurance that what they are seeing is a physical reality, not a digital simulation. It is the difference between watching a video game and watching a demolition derby. One is a rendering of chaos, The other is the actual release of kinetic energy. In an age of green screens, Thea film stands as a monument to Thea engineering of the real, a masterclass in how to use the machinery of cinema to capture the machinery of war. To understand the sheer scale of Thea enterprise that was Rambo First Blood, a Part 2, we must shift our focus from the artistic intent to the brutal realities of production logistics, the unglamorous machinery that converts the dollars into days and days into film. The decision to film in Mexico, specifically in the regions of Atechco and Erpa and near Acapulco, was a calculated location arbitrage designed to maximize the purchasing power of the production budget. While the script called for the humid, dense jungles of Vietnam, the producers knew that a shooting in Southeast Asia in 1984 was a geopolitical impossibility and a logistical nightmare of insurance liability. Mexico offered a cost-benefit analysis that was irresistible. Close proximity to Hollywood for the transport of equipment and dailies, a favorably exchange rate for the peso, and a landscape that with enough smoke and seta dressing could pass for the Mekong Delta. However, this financial saving on paper quickly evaporated in the face of environmental friction, the hidden toxin that geography levies on any large-scale industrial operation. The production unit was not merely a film crew, it was an invading army of over 500 personnel, a logistical beast that required a supply chain of food, water, and electricity in areas where infrastructure was non-existent. The temperature on location frequently exceeded 108 degrees F with 90% humidity, creating a thermal load on the crew and the equipment that slowed the operational tempo to a crawl. This heat was a direct capital drain. Every hour lost to heat exhaustion or equipment failure was thousands of dollars burned with zero footage to show for it. The burn rate of the production, the amount of money spent per day just to keep the lights on, was astronomical, driven by the massive headcount and the heavy machinery required to carve the sets out of the jungle. The construction of the PA camp was a feat of civil engineering, requiring the clear cutting of acres of foliage and the erection of bamboo structures that had to look aged and weathered. A process of artificial depreciation. But the true monument to capital expenditure was the waterfall sequence. The script called for a specific dramatic geography that nature had failed to provide in the chosen location. In a display of brute force logistics, the production team essentially terraformed the landscape, building a dam and diverting a river to create the waterfall needed for Rambo's iconic Mudrai sequence. This single set piece represents the sunk cost of blockbuster film. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in labor and materials were poured into a temporary structure that would exist for a few seconds of screen time and then be dismantled or destroyed. The risk management on set was a constant battle against the local fauna. The jungle was infested with venomous snakes, scorpions, and insects, necessitating the employment of full-time snake wranglers whose sole job was to sanitize the set before the talent arrived. Thesa is a line item in the budget that rarely appears in standard business plans. Biological hazard mitigation. The health of the crew became a major liability. Dysentery and other tropical diseases swept through the unit, reducing the labor efficiency and forcing the schedule to be constantly revised. Stallone himself was not immune to the physical toll, but his human capital was the most protected asset on the sheet. His clear throat, training regimen and diet were strictly controlled to maintain the continuity of his physique, which was in effect the film's primary special effect. The union rules and labor negotiations added another layer of complexity. The production employed a mix of Americana union crew heads and local Mexicana labor, creating a management hierarchy that had to bridge cultural and linguistic gaps in real time. The transportation logistics were equally daunting. Moving heavy generators, camera cranes, and the massive amount of pyrotechnics up narrow, muddy mountain tracks required a fleet of military grade trucks and the constant repair of the roads themselves. The explosives inventory alone was a logistical nightmare. Storing and transporting enough napalm and dynamite to level a small village required strict adherence to safety protocols that were constantly tested by the unpredictable weather. Speaking of weather, the production was hit by Hurricane Odal, a force majeure event that decimated the sets and shut down production, A threatening to push the film over budget and past its release date. In the world of studio economics, a missed release date is the ultimate failure. The opportunity cost of missing the Memorial Day weekend window would have been measured in tens of millions of dollars in lost box office revenue. The producers, Mario Kassar and Andrew Wawagna, had to double down on their investment, authorizing overtime spend to rebuild the sets and accelerate the schedule once the storm passed. The decision to spend their way out of the hole is the classic gambler's ruin scenario, but in this case, they were betting on a sure thing. The aerial logistics were a separate operational theater. The helicopters required fuel, maintenance, and certified pilots, all of which had to be sourced and managed in a remote location. The flight hours were strictly monitored, as aviation fuel and maintenance cycles are hard costs that cannot be negotiated. The tragic death of special effects technician Cliff Winger Jr. remains the darkest entry in the production's ledger, a stark reminder that the safety margin in action film is often thinner than the profit margin. His death underscored the reality that production management is not just about money. It is about the management of life and death in an industrial environment designed to simulate war. As the production neared its conclusion, the post-production schedule was compressed to a diamond-making pressure. The editors were cutting scenes as they were shot, a just-in-time manufacturing process designed to minimize the lag between the final wrap and the first print. The daily rush to get the film developed and reviewed involved flying the negative back to the States, a logistical chain of custody that was vulnerable to loss or damage at every link. The final push to complete the film for its May release was a triumph of crisis management, a testament to the ability of the studio system to mobilize massive resources to meet a hard deadline. When the film finally wrapped, the location was left discarded and altered, the bamboo burned, the mud churned. A physical testament to the extractive industry of film. The local economy of the Mexican towns experienced a temporary boom in bust cycle flooded with American dollars during the shoot and then left to normalize once the circus left town. Ultimately, the production of Rambo First Blood Part 2 was a military operation in everything but name. It had a general, the director, a supply line, a motor pool, and casualties. It demonstrated that the economics of fast spectacle require a level of logistical sophistication that rivals that of a small nation state. The efficiency ratio of the production, the amount of money on the screen versus the amount wasted in the jungle, was likely lower than a studio accountant would prefer. But the gross output was undeniable. Every dollar of friction, every day of delay, and every drop of sweat was captured on the negative, adding a weight and a density to the final product that no green screen could ever emulate. The management of this cosa was the true art form, the invisible hand that guided the capital through the fire and forged it into a blockbuster. To engage with the historical and scientific accuracy of Rambo First Blood Part 2 is to enter a hall of mirrors where emotional truth is deliberately prioritized over empirical fact. The film does not attempt to document the geopolitical reality of 1985, rather, it constructs a hyper-reality designed to serve as a specific cultural hunger for revisionism. The central premise of the film that there were large numbers of living American prisoners of war still being held in secret camps in Vietnam a decade after the fall of Saigon is the most significant historical divergence in the narrative. While the PMEA issue is a genuine source of anguish and political activism in the 80s, investigations by the Senate Select Committee on PMEA Affairs later concluded that there was no compelling evidence to support the existence of such camps. The film, however, treats this conspiracy theory as absolute canonical fact, positioning the government's denial not as evidence of absence, but as proof of a cover-up. This narrative choice is a marketing strategy. It validates the pain of the veteran community by offering them a tangible enemy, the bureaucracy, and a tangible objective, the rescue, transforming a complex diplomatic tragedy into a solvable tactical problem. Geopolitically, the presence of Soviet Spetsnaz troops operating openly in Vietnam in 1985 is another creative liberty taken for dramatic effect. While the Soviet Union did maintain a military presence at Cameron Bay, The idea of Soviet officers personally overseeing the torture of American prisoners in the jungle is a Cold War fantasy designed to simplify the conflict into a binary struggle between superpowers. It allows the film to bypass the nuanced grievances of the Vietnamese Civil War and reframe the conflict as a direct proxy battle between American individualism and Soviet totalitarianism. Scientifically, the film operates on the rule of cool rather than the laws of physics, particularly in its depiction of ballistics and explosives. The Hoi archery compound bow, while a real piece of technology, is shown performing feats that defy material science. Rambo uses explosive torp tips that detonate with the force of a hand grenade upon impact. In reality, really explosive arrowheads exist. The payload capacity of a narrow shaft is limited, and the blast radius shown in the film suggests a quantity of high explosivity that would make the arrow too heavy to fly with any accuracy. Furthermore, the terminal ballistics of the arrows are exaggerated. An arrow, even from a compound bow, relies on a cutting trauma, hemorrhage, to kill. Yet in a film, the impact is often shown to have the immediate stopping power of a high-caliber firearm. The M60 machine gun sequence is another area where cinematic physics overrides reality. Rambo is shown firing the M60 one-handed, a feat that, while theoretically possible for a man of Stallone strength, ignores the recoil mechanics of a weapon that fires 7.62 ammunition at 600 rounds per minute. In the real world, the muzzle climb would be uncontrollable without a bipod or a second point of contact, rendering accuracy impossible. Additionally, the ammunition capacity is a classic movie trope. Rambo fires continuous bursts that would deplete a standard 100-round belt in seconds. Yet, he rarely seems to reload, suggesting he is carrying a magical magazine of infinite capacity. The RPG-7 usage is also stylized. The backblast area of an RPG is lethal, yet characters frequently fire them in confined spaces or with allies directly behind them without a consequence. The helicopter physics in the finally warrant a specific audit. The maneuvers performed by the Soviet Hind, actually a modified Puma, and the American Huey often defy that aerodynamic envelope of rotary wing aircraft. The scene where Rambo fakes a crash to lure the enemy gunship is a tactical gamble that relies on the enemy pilot having zero situational awareness, a scripted incompetence that serves the plot. However, the film does get certain survival science details correct, or at least plausible enough for the genre. The sequence where Rambo uses gunpowder to cauterize a wound is a medically dubious but historically grounded field technique. While it risks severe infection and tissue damage, the thermal cauterization would indeed stop bleeding in a desperate situation. It serves as a visceral demonstration of pain tolerance, reinforcing the protagonist's superhuman status. The camouflage technique in the Mud Wallace sequence is actually a legitimate application of visual disruption. Covering the skin with mud not only masks the thermal signature to a degree, but breaks up the human silhouette, a core principle of military evasion. The leech removal scene is another moment of biological realism. Leeches are a genuine hazard of the Southeast Asian jungle, and their removal with a knife or heat is a standard, if unpleasant, a procedure. The film's depiction of radio technology is functional but simplified. The ease with which Rambo communicates with the base and the clarity of the signal over such distances through dense jungle and atmospheric interference is optimistic engineering. In reality, high-frequency radio communications in that environment would be plagued by static and signal loss, making the dramatic "I'm coming to get you" monologue much harder to deliver clearly. The torture physics of the electrified bed frame is a grim nod to historical methods, but the amperage shown arcs of blue electricity visible to the naked eye would likely cause immediate cardiac arrest rather than just severe pain. Rambo's ability to withstand these voltage without suffering permanent neurological damage or burns is a testament to his mythological physiology rather than medical reality. The napalm explosions are visually spectacular but scientifically inaccurate. Real napalm is a sticky gel-like substance that clings and burns, whereas the movie explosions are largely gasoline-based fireballs that consume themselves quickly in the air. This pyrotechnic license is standard in Hollywood because real napalm is horrifyingly cruel and visually less dynamic than a rolling wall of orangia flame. The sound physics of the weaponry are also enhanced that a suppressor and not the MP5 submachine gun used by Kobe makes a pew-pew sound that is a complete fabrication of Foley art. Relic suppressors reduce the report to a loud crack, not a silent whisper. Ultimately, the accuracy score of Rambo First Blood Part 2 is low if judged by a textbook, but high if judged by the emotional logic of the genre. The film is not a documentary, it is an operatic fantasy of revenge. It trades the complex, messy, and often disappointing reality of war for a clean, physics-defying a clarity where the good guys are indestructible, the bad guys are incompetent, and the explosions are always perfectly framed. It validates the feeling of the veteran experience, the sense of betrayal, the physical hardship, the desire for payback while ignoring the facts that would complicate the narrative. In the business of blockbuster cinema, truth is a depreciating asset while myth is a growth stock that pays dividends forever. To discuss the visual engineering of Rambo First Blood, Part 2 is to discuss a collision between the grit of 80s action cinema and the classical sophistication of Technicolor royalty. The director of photography was Jack Cardiff, a legend whose resume included masterpieces like The Red Shoes and Black Narcissus, films defined by their painterly use of light and color. Hiring Cardiff for a sweaty, violent jungle movie was a talent arbitrage of the highest order. The producers effectively bought the eye of a fine artist to photograph a demolition derby. The result is a film that looks far more expensive and textured than its genre contemporaries, utilizing a high contrast lighting scheme that elevates the imagery from exploitation to a mythology. Cardiff approached the filming of Sylvester Stallone not as a documentation of an actor, but as the lighting of a kinetic sculpture. He utilized dim lighting backlight extensively, positioning heavy HMI lights behind the foliage to rim a silhouette in a halo of light separating him from the chaotic background of the jungle. This technique combined with the constant application of baby oil and water to the actor's skin turned Rambo's musculature into a topographic map of highlights and shadows, a specular landscape that the camera explored with a fetishistic detail. The visual language of the film is built on a strict color dichotomy that separates the two worlds of the narrative. The organic jungle versus the synthetic bureaucracy. The jungle sequences are dominated by a warm palette of saturated greens, deep browns, and the golden hues of the magic hour sun. Cardiff pushed the green channel and the chemical timing of the print, making the foliage feel oppressive and alive, a chlorophyll claustrophobia that surrounds the protagonist. In contrast, the scenes at the Americana base in Thailand and Murdoch's Phasia are lit with cool fluorescence, creating a sterile, sickly environment of cyans, grays, and metallic blues. This color grading strategy subconsciously reinforces the narrative theme: the jungle is dangerous but honest, warm, while the office is safe but corrupt cold. The lighting in the P camp shifts to an noir aesthetic at night, utilizing hard shadows and single source lighting, torches, searchlights to create a sense of imprisonment and despair. The shadow density in these scenes is critical. Cardiff allowed the blacks to crush, hiding the terrifying details of the camp in the darkness, forcing the audience to lean into the frame. The mid-rise sequence is perhaps the most famous example of camouflage lighting in cinema history. The camera is locked off, framing a wall of mud and roots that appears static and lifeless. The lighting is flat and diffuse, hiding on contours that might reveal a human form. When Rambo opens his eyes, the white of the scar cuts through the brown texture like a signal flare, a visual shock that relies entirely on contrast ratios. As he peels himself from the wall, the lighting shifts, catching the wet mud in his skin and transforming him from a piece of the set into a living weapon. The cinematography of the aerial sequences required a different kind of engineering, hard mount stabilization. The cameras were bolted to the airframes of the helicopters to capture the vibration and the visceral shake of the rotors, transferring the mechanical stress of the aircraft directly to the viewer. Cardiff and director George P. Cosmatos used wide-angle anamorphic lenses inside the cockpits to exaggerate the claustrophobia of the pilots and to capture the panoramic sweep of the terrain outside the canopy. Deci lenses, specifically the Panavision Ka series, introduce barrel distortion at the edges of the frame, bending the horizon slightly and making the speed of the aircraft feel faster and more reckless. The lens flares in the film are anamorphic horizontal streaks, often blue or gold, which became a signature aesthetic of 80s action, signaling the presence of intense artificial light sources, explosions, searchlights within the frame. The pyrotechnic cinematography deserves its own analysis. Filming an explosion requires a specific exposure calculation to ensure the fireball doesn't blow out into a white blob. Cardiff stopped down at the aperture during the major blast to retain the rich oranges and blacks of the rolling nipim, sacrificing shadow detail in the trees to capture the texture of the flame itself. This dynamic range management is what give us the explosions their weight. You can see the debris, the smoke patterns, and the different temperatures of the fire. The slow motion overcranking was used sparingly but effectively, specifically to emphasize the impact physics of the arrows in the falls by shooting at 48 or 60 frames per second. The film expands the moment of violence, allowing the audience to process the kinetic energy transfer that would otherwise be a blur. The visual texture of the film is also defined by the elements. Rain, mud, and sweat are constant filters between the lens and the subject. Cardiff did not wipe the lens when water hit it. He incorporated the optical interference of the rain droplets to add a layer of varied realism, making the viewer feel like they are standing in the storm. The compositional geometry often places a Rambo in the center of the frame, isolated with the lines of the jungly bamboo trees creating natural persona bars around him even when he is technically free. This visual motif of entrapment persists until the third act, where the composition opens up to wide heroic angles as he takes control of the helicopter and the narrative. The Z-axis movement is utilized heavily in the action scenes, with Rambo running towards or away from the camera or arrows flying directly into the lens, breaking the fourth wall with projectile aggression. The grain structure of the film stock used, likely Kodak 5247 or 5294, adds a grittiness to the image that digital sensors lack. That the film grain dances in the shadows, adding a subconscious visual noise that mirrors the chaos of the story. This grain is an essential part of the film's period patina. It feels like a document from a specific era of chemical filmmaking. Ultimately, the cinematography of Rambo First Blood Part 2 is not just about recording action, it is about a myth-making. Cardiff's lighting transforms a bodybuilder into a demigod and a Mexicana forest into a mythical underworld. It elevates the production value of the film far above its script, proving that in cinema, the way a thing is lit can be just as important as what the thing actually is. The visual engineering seduces the eye, making the violence beautiful and the hero iconic, ensuring that the image of Rambo holding the M60 is burned into the cultural retina forever. The sonic architecture of Rambo First Blood Part 2 is not merely an accompaniment to the image. It is a structural component of the film's emotional engineering, a heavy industrial soundscape designed to bypass the intellect and strike directly at the adrenal cortex. At the helm of this auditory assault was the legendary composer Jerry Goldsmith, a titan of film music who understood that for Rambo to become a myth, he needed a voice that transcended dialogue. Goldsmith's score is a groundbreaking fusion of traditional orchestral militarism and the cutting-edge electronic synthesis of 1985, creating a hybrid texture that perfectly mirrors the duality of the protagonist, an ancient warrior fighting a modern war. The main title theme is iconic not for its bombast, but for its melancholic nobility. It utilizes a solo trumpet that mourns rather than celebrates, grounding the character in a deep sense of loss before a single shot is fired. However, as the film transitions to the jungle, Goldsmith introduces a relentless percussive drive that utilizes synthesizer ostinato, a repetitive electronic pulses that mimic the heartbeat of a man under extreme duress. This electronic pulse was achieved using the Yamaha DX7 and other early digital synthesizers, instruments that were often used for pop music, but here are weaponized to create a sense of cold and mechanical dread. The score treats the synthesizer not as a futuristic element, but as the sound of the system, the colder logic of the technology that is hunting a Rambo. In contrast, the orchestral sections, particularly the strings and a brass, represent the organic rage of the character, swelling in volume and a complexity as he unleashes his violence. The action cues are masterpieces of polyrhythmic complexity, layering multiple time signatures to create a sense of chaos that feels controlled only by the editor's cuts. But the music is only a half of the equation. The sound design, Foley, and effects is a separate layer of narrative information that tells the audience exactly how lethal the environment is. The sound of the compound bow is a specific auditory signature that defines the film's stealth sequences. The sound designers created a composite sound for the arrow release, a blend of a whip crack, a rush of air, and a metallic thip that defies physics but perfectly communicates the kinetic potential of the weapon. When the arrow impacts a target, the sound is a wet, a visceral thud that emphasizes the biological trauma of the kill, contrasting sharply with the clean bang of a firearm. The M60 machine gun is another character in the soundscape. Its report was enhanced with lower frequency boom to make it feel heavier and more destructive than a standard rifle. The sound of the spent brass casings hitting the ground *dink-a-tink-dink* is mixed high in the track, a rhythmic counterpoint to the roar of the muzzle emphasizing the sheer volume of lead being expended. The jungle ambience serves as the film's noise floor, a constant oppressive layer of insect buzzing, bird calls, and wind that never stops, creating a sonic claustrophobia that surrounds the viewer. This ambient track was carefully constructed to change with the narrative. When danger approaches, the insects often fall silent, a sonic void that signals a predator is near. The Russian dialogue in the film is often left unsubtitled or mixed low, turning it into a texture of alien aggression rather than specific information. The viewer doesn't need to know exactly what Podovsky is saying. The harsh guttural phonemes and the sneering delivery communicate the threat perfectly. The helicopter sound effects are a dominant force in the second half of the film. The sound of the rotor blades *wop* is a physical frequency that vibrates the theater speakers, creating a visceral sensation of pressure. The sound team differentiated the American Huey lighter faster chop from the Soviet Honda heavy grinding drone, giving each machine a distinct sonic personality. The explosion effects were mixed to prioritize the bass response, utilizing the subwoofer channel in Dolby Stereo theaters to shake the floorboards. This tactile audio ensures that the audience feels the blast wave before they process the visual information, creating a startle reflex that heightens the immersion. The silence is used as a weapon in the mixing process. Just before a major ambush or the mutiny kill, the track often drops to near zero, forcing the audience to hold their breath. This dynamic range manipulation, the difference between the quietest whisper and the loudest explosion, is extreme in this film, a deliberate choice to maximize the impact of the violence. The voice of Sylvester Stallone himself is a key element of the sound design. His dialogue is sparse, often delivered in a low, resonant rumble that feels like it is emanating from the chest rather than the throat. This vocal texture reinforces his status as a primal force. He doesn't speak, he growls. The scream of Rambo during the torture scene is a sonic event of pure agony, a raw, unmodulated vocal performance that cuts through the electronic hum of the torture device. The mix of the film favors the harder effects, guns, punches over the music in the combat scenes, a decision that keeps the violence feeling brutal and immediate rather than operatic. However, in the final montage, the music swells to dominate the track, transforming the destruction into a heroic symphony. The end credits song, A Piece in Her Life, performed by Frank Stallone, serves as a during but appropriate cool-down track. Its lyrics attempt to articulate the themes of the film in a pop ballad format, a commercial necessity for the soundtrack album, but a strange emotional pivot from the carnage that preceded it. Ultimately, the sound design of Rambo First Blood Part 2 is a masterclass in aggression. It utilizes every frequency of the audible spectrum to assault, comfort, and manipulate the viewer. Ida proves that in action cinema, the ears are the most direct path to the nervous system. The sound of the bow being drawn aback is the sound of tension. The sound of the explosion is the sound of fire release. And in the dark of the theater, that cycle of tension and release is the heartbeat of the blockbuster experience. The marketing campaign for Rambo First Blood Part 2 was not merely an advertisement for a movie. It was a psychological operation designed to penetrate the collective consciousness of the American public and reformat their perception of the Vietnam War. TriStar Pictures and Carco understood that they were not selling a film about a sad veteran. They were selling a product of national catharsis. A therapeutic explosive device wrapped in a celluloid. The high concept pitch was brutally simple. What if we could go back and win? This question formed the core value a proposition of the entire campaign, tapping into a market deficit, a Victoria that had plagued the American psyche since 1975. The poster art created by Renato Cazroa is perhaps the single most effective piece of key art in action movie history. It features Sylvester Stallone stripped to the waist, muscly glistening with sweat and oil, holding a massive RPG-7 rocket launcher with a defiant expression. This image is subtle. It is a visual manifesto of individual power. The composition places a Rambo against a backdrop of flames, effectively communicating the genre, action, the tone, violent, and the promise, destruction, in a single glance. The tagline, "No man, no law, no war can stop him," was a directed challenge to the administrative state that the audience blamed for the war's failure. It positioned Rambo as a force of nature outside the jurisdiction of incompetent bureaucrats and cowardly politicians. The trailer's strategy was equally aggressive, focusing almost exclusively on the money shots, the helicopter explosions, the bow kills, the waterfall scene. The trailer cut was edited to a frantic rhythm, using the Jerry Goldsmith score to build a sense of irresistible momentum. It avoided the dialogue-heavy scenes of the first act, knowing that the target demographic, young males, was buying a ticket for the kinetics, not the politics. However, the most audacious aspect of the marketing was the cross-generational merchandising strategy. Despite the film being rated R for extreme violence, language, and torture, the studio licensed the character of Rambo for a massive line of children's toys produced by Geico. The Rambo, the Force of Freedom action figure line became a top seller, allowing 10-year-old boys to reenact the violent fantasies of the film in their backyards. This was a calculated brand extension that normalized the imagery of the film for a generation that was technically too young to see it. They even launched a frantic animated television series, stripping away the blood and the PTSD to turn Rambo into a G.I. Joe-style superhero who fought a fictional organization called Sabotage. This sanitization of violence for the youth market was a controversial but highly profitable move, creating a cradle-to-grave brand loyalty. The video game tie-ins were also crucial. Arcadia cabinets and home console games allowed the audience to be Rambo, reinforcing the power fantasy through interactive media. The political marketing was an accidental but potent force multiplier. President Ronald Reagan, sensing the cultural wind, famously referenced the film in a microphone check, joking, "Hey boy, after seeing Rambo last night, you know what to do next time this happens." This endorsement from the Commander-in-Chief was worth millions in free advertising. It validated the film as a piece of patriotic art rather than just a violent bluff. The media coverage of the film focused heavily on the Rambo mania, creating a feedback loop where seeing the movie became a cultural necessity to be part of the conversation. The merchandise revenue from t-shirts, bandanas, and plastic knives likely rivaled the box office gross in certain territories. The international marketing required a slight pivot. Outside of the US, the Vietnam revisionism was less potent, so the campaign focused on Rambo as a universal symbol of the oppressed underdog fighting the system. In Europe and Asia, the film was marketed as a pure action spectacle, emphasizing the Stallone brand, which was already established globally through Rocky. The app testing of different trailer cuts for different markets ensured that the messaging resonated with local cultural sensibilities. For example, in Japan, the marketing emphasized the Bushido aspects of Rambo's character, his stoicism, his loyalty, his mastery of the bow, positioning him as a modern samurai. The release date strategy was executed with a military precision. Opening on Memorial Day weekend in the US was a strategic move to align the film with a national holiday honoring veterans. This calendar synchronization turned the opening weekend into a patriotic event, encouraging families and groups of friends to attend together. The press junket saw Stallone giving interviews that blended his personal underdog story with the character's narrative, blurring the lines between the actor and the role. He spoke passionately about the plight of the mass, positioning the film as an advocacy project to bring attention to a forgotten issue. This moral high ground of marketing helped deflect the criticism from liberal reviewers who saw the film as jingoistic trash. By framing the movie as a tribute to the veterans, the studio made it socially difficult to criticize without appearing unpatriotic. That soundtrack album was an author marketing tool featuring the Frank Stallone song and the Jerry Goldsmith score, keeping the sonic brand of the film on the radio waves. Ultimately, the marketing of Rambo First Blood Part 2 was a triumph of integrated brand management. It took a grim psychological character study, First Blood, and successfully rebranded it as a colorful toy-friendly blockbuster franchise. It proved that with the right packaging, even the darkest traumas of a nation could be sold back to the mass entertainment. The audience didn't just buy a ticket. They bought a feeling of strength, a radar headband, and a plastic machine gun. They bought the lie because the packaging was irresistible. And in the business of Hollywood, the packaging is the product. The critical reception of Rambo First Blood Part 2 functions as a perfect Rorschach test for the cultural divide of 1985, a moment where the elite consensus and the popular will diverged so violently that they seemed to be watching two different films. Upon its release, the film was greeted by the mainstream press not merely with negative reviews, but with a palpable sense of moral outrage and intellectual condescension. Critics like Vincent Comey of the New York Times and Roger acknowledged the technical proficiency of the filmmaking, but decried the narrative as a dangerous xenophobic fantasy that pandered to the basest instincts of the American electorate. The film was labeled propaganda in the poorest sense, a celluloid recruitment buster for a new era of aggressive foreign policy that sought to solve complex diplomatic failures with high explosive arrows. This critical hostility culminated in the film's dominance at the 6th Golden Raspberry Awards, where it won Worst Picture, Worst Actor for Sylvester Stallone, Worst Screenplay, and Worst Original Song. These anti-awards were a clear signal from the Hollywood intelligentsia that the rejected the film's ethos, viewing it as a grotesque cartoon of patriotism that lacked the nuanced tragedy of the original First Blood. However, these critical dubbing was entirely irrelevant to the market reality. In fact, the negative reviews likely acted as a contrarian indicator, fueling the film's appeal to a demographic that felt alienated by the very critics who were mocking it. While the writers in New York and Los Angeles laughed at the dialogue, audiences in the heartland wept at the closing speech and cheered at the explosions, validating the producer's bet on the silent majority. The only institution of high culture that recognized the film's merit was the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, which nominated it for Best Sound Effects Editing, a technical concession that admitted, "We hate what this movie says, but we cannot deny how well it sounds." The legacy forecast of the film is dominated by the concept of the Rambo effect, a term that entered the political lexicon to describe a foreign policy stance based on unilateral action, overwhelming force, and a disregard for international consensus. President Ronald Reagan himself weaponized the film's popularity, famously joking after the 1985 hostage crisis in Beirut, "Boy, after seeing a Rambo last night, I know what to do next time this happens." This endorsement from the Commander-in-Chief dissolved the barrier between pop culture and statecraft, transforming John Rambo from a fictional character into an avatar of the Reagan doctrine. It is impossible to overstate the impact this film had on the action archetype of the 1980s. Before Rambo, action heroes were often cops, a bullet, Dirty Harry, or everyman in bada situations. Die Hard came later. Rambo First Blood Part 2 codified the one-man army trope. The idea of the hypermuscular invincible warrior who requires no support, no logistics, and no team to dismantle an entire army. This archetype spawned a decade of imitators from Arnold Schwarzenegger in Commando to Chuck Norris in Missing in Action, creating an entire subgenre economy of jungle bust rescue films that flooded the VHS market. Culturally, the film became a global export of American soft power, projecting an imagery of the United States as a sleeping giant that when woken would visit biblical destruction upon its enemies. Interestingly, the film found a massive audience in the global south and even behind the Iron Curtain via bootleg tapes where audiences ignored the anti-communist politics and simply embraced the anti-authoritarian narrative of one man fighting the system. To the Afghan Mujahideen, whom Rambo would join in the next sequel, he was a symbol of resistance against the Soviet Empire. To the kids in the suburbs of Chicago, he was a superhero who didn't wear a cape. Today, the film holds a unique vintage valuation. It is no longer viewed as dangerous propaganda, but as a pristine artifact of Cold War anxiety, a time capsule that preserved the fears and desires of a specific moment in history. Modern critics engaging in revisionist analyses often praise the film's pacing, visual beauty, thanks to Jakarta and its honest, if blunt, articulation of the veteran's trauma. It is recognized as a masterpiece of pure cinema, motion, color, and sound arranged to produce a visceral physical reaction unburdened by the need for a realism or logic. The merchandising legacy also endures. The image of Rambo tying his headband is as recognizable as Mickey Mouse's ears, a piece of visual IP that transcends language and borders. The film's structural influence is still felt in modern blockbusters. The gear-up montage that a stealth kill sequence and the boss fight in a helicopter are now a standard grammar in the language of action cinema. Ultimately, the legacy of Rambo First Blood Part 2 is that Ida won the argument. The critics faded into obscurity, but the character became immortal. It proved that in the marketplace of ideas, a simple, powerful lie often travels further and faster than a complex, messy truth. It stands as a monument to the decade of excess, a film that was too loud, too violent, and too simplistic for the critics, which is exactly why it was perfect for the world. As we stand at the extraction point of this cinematic operation, and looking back at the carnage and the commerce of 1985, it becomes clear that Rambo First Blood Part 2 is not merely a sequel, but a singularity in the timeline of action cinema. It represents the moment where the art of war and the business of show achieved a perfect terrifying synchronization, creating a product that was chemically pure in its intention and devastatingly effective in its execution. We have deconstructed the film into its atomic components that a financial ambition of Carol Pictures who leveraged a $25 million risk to build an empire. The technological ingenuity of the practical effects team who engineered explosions with the precision of fast sculptors and the psychological architecture of a character who became the avatar for nations' unresolved grief. The genius of this film lies not in its subtlety, of which it has none, but in its absolute clarity. To identify the market inefficiency, the lingering trauma of the Vietnam War, and filled that void with a high-yield fantasy of competence and revenge. Ida provided a corrective narrative for a generation of men who felt that their sacrifices had been devalued by a political class that was more interested in optics than honor. By turning John Rambo from the tragic victim of First Blood into the invincible Avenger of Part 2, the filmmakers did not just make a movie, they performed a cultural exorcism. They allowed the audience to refight the war in the safety of a darkened theater and for 2 hours to win. This emotional transaction was the true source of the film's massive return on investment. The audience paid for the ticket, but what they were really buying was the feeling of closure. The technical legacy of the film is equally profound. The work of Jakarta proved that an action movie could look like a Renaissance painting, utilizing a light and shadow to elevate the violencia into something approaching myth. The sonic architecture created by Jerry Goldsmith and the sound team set a new standard for auditory immersion, proving that the sound of a bowring could be also iconic as the roar of a jet engine. But perhaps the most enduring lesson of this film is its demonstration of star power as a tangible economic asset. Sylvester Stallone did not just act in this film, he inhabited it, reshaping his own body into a special effect that was more convincing than any digital creation it could ever be. His commitment to the physicality of the role, the sweat, the veins, the scars created a true Thena advertising that resonated with the audiences on a primal level. He was not playing a soldier. He was offering himself up as a sacrificial totem enduring the pain so that the audience could feel the catharsis. The film also stands as a testament to the efficiency of analog film. In an era before CGI, every stunt, every explosion, and every helicopter maneuver had to be physically performed, creating a texture of danger that modern films often lack. The risk was real, the fire was hot and the mud was wet. This tactile reality is what gives the film its enduring weight. Even the film's flaws, the jingoism, the historical inaccuracies, the simplistic dialogue contribute to its power. It is a monolith of 80s culture, a smooth-hearted object that refuses to apologize for what it is. It captures the zeitgeist of the Reagan era perfectly. The belief in American exceptionalism, the distrust of bureaucracy, and the faith in the individual's ability to overcome a systemic failure through sheer force of will. As Rambo walks away from the helicopter in that final shot, he is noted just leaving the war. He is walking into immortality. He has become a permanent asset in the global pop culture portfolio, a symbol that transcends language and borders. He is the patron saint of lost causes. The man who goes back when everyone else has left, the man who fights when the war is already over. The film ends not with a parade, but with a plea for love, a surprisingly tender note that recontextualizes the violence that preceded it. It reminds us that beneath the muscles and the ammunition, there is a human heart that just wants to come home. And in the end, that is the business of cinema. To take our deepest fears and our highest hopes and project them onto a screen 30 feet high, allowing us to see ourselves not as we are, but as we wish we could be. Rambo First Blood Part 2 is a masterclass in wish fulfillment, a perfect product delivered at the perfect time to a hungry market. It is a film that conquered the world not with logic, but with emotion, proving that in the dark, we all want to believe that one man can make a difference.